Dave, you had a great interest in television, presumably while you were at school.
I did indeed, yes. I was always absolutely fascinated by television,
Yeah.
even when I was a boy.
Yeah.
Not with the programmes so much, but with the technology of television.
Yeah.
That's what fascinated me. I remember back in the late 1950s, it must have been, watching the TV repairman fixing our ancient sort of Echo BBC only TV set in the
Yes,
corner of the
yes.
living room, and seeing the glowing valves and the tube and all that, and thinking, gosh, this is amazing. What
Yeah.
an amazing sort of amazing thing this is.
Well, you were a tinkerer, did you?
Oh, yes.
Did you build your own radio sets and things
I
like
never
that?
built one from scratch, but I spent an enormous amount of time tinkering with television sets and radios, record players, radiograms, you name
Yeah,
it, when I
yeah.
was at school. And it was something that just fascinated me. I mean, all sort of valve stuff, of course, in those days.
Yeah.
And, probably quite dangerous, some of the stuff I did, actually, looking back with hindsight. And I made up my mind when I came to leave school, do my A-levels, that I wanted to work in television, and I wanted to work in the technical side of television. In those days, of course, that really meant going to the BBC, because the BBC were the only organisation then that actually had its own training system. There used to be a standing joke that the BBC trained everybody in television, including the ITV people, because of course
It trained for the industry.
absolutely
That was the purpose.
I mean,
yeah.
the BBC would train people. They'd work for the BBC for a few years if you were lucky, and then of course they'd go to ITV for more money. But there were two ways into what I wanted to do. I could either try and join straight from school as what was then called, might still be called, I don't know, a technical assistant, which was considered to be a sort of trainee engineer's job. Or I could go to college, hopefully, and get a relevant degree in physics, engineering, electronics, more accurately, which would allow me to come in as what was called a direct entry engineer. Yeah, where you went into the BBC as an engineer,
Right.
straight from college, and they would give you training, obviously, in whatever you were going to be specialising in, television, radio, whatever, transmitters, and but you were considered to be already sort of qualified, because you'd got
Yes.
a college degree. I decided to try and go straight from school, and I've not actually ever regretted that. I mean, there were odd periods, where I sort of thought, I wish I had gone to college, because so many other people I knew, of course, had done. But actually, at the end of the day, it really didn't make any difference.
You could have gone in the tech ops side, but you went on the engineering
I wanted
side.
to do the engineering side because, I didn't know a huge amount about how it all worked at that time. I do remember going on a trip while I was at school to the Thames television studios that were then in Euston Tower. And I don't know who arranged that. I actually can't remember whether it was arranged by somebody at the school. But that was the first time I actually went into a television production facility. And I, saw what they did and the equipment they had. Fascinated me even more, of course, made me want even more to become part of it. And I decided that, if I went in as a technical assistant, and I would get, 3 years of on-station experience, which was good. And of course, as I quite rightly assumed, had I got an electronics degree or something like that, the vast majority of what I would have learned on that degree would have been totally useless to me in my BBC career. Mainly because, I went into an operational engineering area, which I'll come into later. Yes. So I joined straight from school. Thankfully, they didn't expect me to have a huge number of A-levels or anything. I think the only criteria were that you had to have studied either maths or physics up to A-level standard. That was the only the criterion. They weren't particularly interested in whether you'd actually pass the A-levels or not, which was just as well, as I just scraped a pass in physics, and that's the only A-level I've got. So they'd already accepted me before the A-level results came out, so I thought, great, this is good. So I joined at 18 and a half in September 1971, and I retired took redundancy in June 2009. So I was actually in the BBC for 3 months short of 38 years. And I'm the only person actually that I left school with that I know of who actually spent their entire career working for the same employer. Which was the way it was then, of course.
Yes.
If you went into an organisation like the BBC, you considered it to be a job for life.
Yeah.
And for me it was.
It had so much variety,
Absolutely.
and it was a very good employer.
Yes, yes.
So, did you go straight to Evesham?
Yes, I didn't have a very auspicious start, actually. I was due, obviously, to report to the training centre at Evesham for my A course, as it was, of course, A10, if anyone's interested. I missed my train at Paddington, which in those days was not good news. I mean, I don't know what it's like now, but the trains were quite infrequent then, in 1971, and I cannot remember for the life of me why I missed the train, but I missed it anyway. And of course, in those days, before the days of mobile phones and all that, of course, this meant going and finding a call box and ringing the training centre and saying, I'm terribly sorry, I missed my train, I'm going to be late, and I was going to be hours late, 2-3 hours late probably. And I was dreading their reaction, but actually they were reasonably okay about it. I mean, I did get the next train to Evesham and got a cab up to the training centre, and by that time the course members had already assembled in one of the huts, and they were having induction sort of lectures and talks and that sort of thing. And I remember creeping in, thinking, "Oh my goodness, this is going to be terrible." I said, "I'm terribly sorry. I'm Dave Hawley. I'm terribly sorry. I'm so late." And they said, "Oh, don't worry. Just sit down."
Just sit down. Okay.
The other thing I should mention is I was wearing a suit. The only time I ever wore a suit on BBC duty, because I didn't know what to expect. I thought, I'd better dress up, because this is the BBC, and
were the others wearing suits?
No, I don't think so.
Really?
No, I think a few of them might be, but there were probably people that wore suits anyway. I didn't.
Yes.
I'm jeans and t-shirts guy, always have been. And I thought, I cannot turn up my first day in the BBC wearing jeans and a t-shirt. I don't know how they might react, So I did put my suit on, and that was the only time. And I look back, and that seems so silly now, but
Yeah. Well,
on the first day in the job, you don't take any chances.
No, you don't. No, you don't. Absolutely not. But what does it feel like? Did it feel very informal? Was it formal then?
Yes, it did in some ways. I mean, I should say that I'd actually been at boarding school for 7 years before that. So actually going to the training centre, which is obviously a residential training centre, where you lived, was not that much of a change for me. It obviously was for a lot of people. I do remember the warden at Evesham, whose name escapes me. I remember chatting to him once, and the A course members, particularly as a matter of policy, they put into shared bedrooms. And he said that was a deliberate policy decision to give them company, because in the majority of cases, it was the first time they'd ever been away from home.
Yes.
Now, for me, it was just like going for another school term. So, it didn't worry me in the slightest. I can imagine some people probably found it a bit of a wrench to suddenly be away from home for 3 months, for perhaps the first time in their lives.
But you hadn't been to any other BBC buildings, so you went straight to Evesham, and that was
Straight to Evesham, yes. Well, I mean, I did a job interview, of course, in Cavendish Square. Yes, which I do remember reasonably well. They asked me things about Ohm's law and things like this, basic physics questions. And I remember it being slightly intimidating, but not too bad. I mean, I think they were very good, really. I mean, they obviously knew what I wanted, and I gave them the questions, the right answer to the questions that they were expecting. I'm terrible at interview boards. I'm appallingly bad at interview boards, because I never know what they want to hear. I think, well, what do they want me to say? I mean, if it's just answers, to direct questions where there's no interpretation involved, then it's fine. But if they ask me things like, why do you want to do this job, and all this sort of thing, I think, well, what do they want to hear, but it was fine. Obviously I got the job. So
And what were they teaching you? What was an engineering course there about?
Basically, the A course was actually the A course was the sort of induction course, as it were, that gave you the basic grounding in how the technology of television works, and radio and transmitters, everything. You then went on station for 6 months or something, and you then did a B course, which was specific to your discipline. whether it was television, radio, transmitters, whatever. But the A course was very much a general grounding in broadcasting electronics, basically. What sort of equipment was used to make and transmit television
and
radio
purely
programs.
Analog, obviously.
Oh, indeed, very much, yes. And
now it would be totally different. I imagine.
Absolutely, it would. Yes, it saddens me slightly when I look at the way the industry has gone now. That virtually everything you do in the industry is a variation on sitting in a darkened room in front of a computer.
Yes.
Yeah, everything is.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, in the days I'm talking about, of course, you had to know so many different types of equipment, actual hardware that you had to know how to operate and how to maintain, how to repair, all that sort of thing. Now it's all computers. It's just, so boring, I think.
Well, I agree with you, actually, yes. Did you? I mean, there was broadcast equipment there, so you could actually make a television program. Did you get much experience with the kit itself?
Yes, I mean, part of the course was to actually make a television program.
Good.
And I have to say that most of the equipment at Evesham at that time was very antiquated. It was not state of the art because, of course, they got the hand-me-downs from the actual studios. So it was all equipment that had been given to them by Broadcasting House and Television Centre. A lot of it was still valves, I mean, really, really old stuff, that was out of date even then. I mean, they had a small amount of colour stuff because, of course, the service had only been fully colour, television service had only been fully colour for 2 years when I joined. And, of course, all the new colour equipment had all gone to getting this service up and running, and there wasn't really much spare to pass on to the training centre. But of course, a lot of what you did, of course, was irrelevant whether it was colour or black and white. The principles were still the same, but we were still using old image orthicon cameras with turret lenses that you wound around. And they had I think one ME 2001 colour camera, one of the 4-tube colour cameras, which one of the exercises was registering it. Getting the red, green, and blue pictures to sort of line up together.
Sure. But you were taught how to frame shots and that sort of thing as well?
Oh yes, indeed, yes, and lighting as well. We were given the basics of lighting, even though that wasn't going to be part of our job. We were given the basics of things like that. And obviously we were also given a training in radio, in sound, and transmitters as well. They had an ancient valve transmitter there, which they used to proudly fire up. Surprised it didn't actually catch fire. And
of course it was a regional centre of government, though.
It was indeed during the war. Yes.
Maybe that transmitter was sitting there potentially to be used.
Well, who knows? I mean, there was the famous bunker under the breeding wing, of course, which everyone who ever went to Evesham will remember. Yes. This rather flimsy sort of classroom block sitting on top of this enormous concrete box, which was actually the nuclear war bunker. I found Evesham an absolutely fascinating place. It was incredible, and the fact it was built round this period hall, with all the Gothic towers and everything. Was amazing. It had lost its roof by the time I joined.
Had it?
Yeah. I mean, there was a bad fire at Woodlawn Hall.
I didn't know that.
Probably it might have been in the 1950s, actually, certainly the 60s, and it lost its whole top floor.
But it had been rebuilt.
The top floor was still missing when I went there for my courses. It was restored later in the 1990s, I think. They spent a huge amount of money on restoring it back to its former glory because, of course, it had been butchered everywhere. They sawn great holes in the panelling to put cables through and all sorts of things. I mean, it was in a dreadful state.
It's now a hotel.
It's now a very upmarket hotel, yes. And I have stayed there. We had an away day there.
Oh, really?
Yes, back in the 2000s, I think it probably was early 2000s.
Right.
And it was very nice indeed. I hardly recognised it.
How many people were on your course?
I think about 20. Mm-hmm. Yes, the A course was quite large because it included everybody from every discipline. Yeah, when you did the B course, it was that bit smaller because it was only television or only transmitters or only radio. So yes, probably about 20 of us.
And they were agreeable, these people?
Absolutely, yes. No, I've always had enormous respect for the BBC's recruitment policies. In all the years that I worked at the BBC, I have very rarely discovered anybody who was actually a square peg in a round hole and really shouldn't have been there. There was the odd few. Inevitably there was going to be the odd few, but generally everybody got on together. Everybody had the purpose, as it were, of being devoted to the BBC, and I think that's a great tribute to the way they weeded people out when they interviewed them.
Now you came to the end of the course. Were you then given the opportunity to choose where you went?
No. Obviously, I knew I was going to work in television. I always knew I was going to work in television. What I didn't know was what area of television I was going to go into, and this is actually quite important with the history of my career, and something that I considered unbelievably fortunate with hindsight.
Oh, right. So what were the options?
In television, the options were to go into studios engineering, which obviously involved maintaining the equipment used by the studios, the cameras, the microphones, all that sort of thing. But basically it was a backroom workshop job, as you would expect an engineering job to be. Yeah. Now, I was incredibly fortunate that I was posted to what was then called television recording department. Now, in those days, that consisted of 3 sections. It consisted of telecine, who handled film transmission and film inserts into studio programs, videotape, which obviously handled videotape, recording, editing, transmitting, and there was this rather strange outpost as well that was at that time called film maintenance. It later became film engineering services, and what they did was they maintained the equipment used by the film department
at Ealing.
And at Lime Grove and other places as well. Basically, they were responsible for maintaining the equipment that was in the transfer suites and the dubbing theatres and the edit suites and all that sort of thing, and the equipment that was taken out by the film crews. Everything except the cameras. The cameras, which were all sort of Ariflexes or whatever, they were maintained by their manufacturer, generally. But the other equipment, which was often BBC equipment, BBC built and designed equipment, was maintained in workshops that were run by this film maintenance department. The fortunate thing about television recording was it was one of only 2 departments in television where the equipment was actually operated by engineers. The other one was news. And I very quickly discovered when I went on station that what I really loved was actually doing a technical job, but being directly involved in the actual making of programs. Had I gone to studios where you had engineers and operators, completely separate, so the boom operators, the cameramen were a completely different department to the workshop engineers. Had I gone there and been put into a maintenance workshop, I don't think I would have stayed in the BBC as long as I did, because I would have found that very boring after a while. But the fact that I went into initially telecine and I was actually involved in making programs really brought it alive for me. I mean, I loved telecine because I loved film anyway. I'd done things like being a film projectionist and that sort of thing when I was at school. So it was just I was just so happy that I was doing something which I'd done before and I loved, and I was sitting running films in a machine with sort of 20 million people watching.
Right.
Watching
so
the output of that machine.
You were operating.
Absolutely.
But
yes.
you were operating telecine.
Yes. But we were also engineers.
Yes.
So we also had to know how to line up the equipment, how to maintain the equipment, how to repair it when it went wrong. So it wasn't a purely operational job. I mean, that all changed in the 1980s, but at that time, you were an operational engineer. And historically, that was simply because in the early days, of course, the equipment was very unreliable. I mean, it used to break down all the time. So you needed engineers in charge of it who would immediately leap in. If a telecine machine started malfunctioning when you were on the air, you had to know what was wrong and how to do something about it. And same applied in videotape and as well, and
now if you were running a telecine machine during a transmission, was there much you could do to the picture?
Oh yes. I mean, we had a system. Going back to the black and white days, which obviously is before my time, you had what was called lift and gain controls, which are just basically the brightness and contrast of the picture, which was all that mattered, obviously, in the black and white days. When colour came along, of course, this became a lot more complex because although hopefully you were running a film that was graded, had to be optically graded by the laboratories and therefore not varying all over the place shot to shot, you needed some way of actually correcting the colour because obviously the way the machine analysed the film varied depending on the film stock and all sorts of other things. Yeah, we started off with sort of control panels, which just had sort of 4 knobs on them, in addition to the lift and gain knobs. And then we graduated, and initially this was only for the very worst films, to a joystick system where you could actually held a couple of joysticks in your hand, and you twisted them to do the lift and gain, brightness and contrast, and you moved them around to change the colour.
You rode the film as it went out.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, horrendous looking back now. I mean, the results would be considered untransmittable now, because of course, if a shot came up the wrong colour, it would then correct itself in full view of everybody.
Yes.
Because I mean, programming came along later. Pre-programming of shots. Which did it all sort of automatically when you ran it. But in the early days, it was completely manual, and it was called tariff.
It's Tom's apparatus for the rectification of indifferent film.
Yes, or television apparatus for the rectification of inferior film. Or there's a lot of variations on it. But tariff became the classic BBC acronym for that system. Yeah, it was used elsewhere, of course, as well.
Yes.
It had to be. The telecine manufacturers made colour correction systems, which but what we had was BBC made, BBC, like almost everything was.
BBC design, was it?
Oh yes,
yes.
Oh, yes. The telecine machines themselves weren't. Yeah, they were always bought from companies like Syntel, but all the peripheral equipment, was all made by the BBC, designed by the BBC, as everything was. Everything in the bays and all the racks, all the distribution amplifiers, everything was all BBC designed stuff.
Yes, there was design's department, of course.
Absolutely, yes, an equipment department. They were huge. They did everything. Even vision mixers and that sort of thing were made by the BBC.
Were you were at Television Centre, not Lime Grove, were you? Or what?
I worked at Lime Grove sometimes. I was always based at Television Centre, but of course in those days there was an outpost at Lime Grove, which was. Well, it became the topical production centre. It became the home of programmes like Panorama and Nationwide and that sort of thing. And also Match of the Day and things like that were done there as well. Yes. Sport was done there. Sure. And we used to go down there for a fortnight, every few months, to man the equipment down there, because obviously they had telecines and videotape machines there, as well as the main areas of Television Centre. I loved Lime Grove. I thought it was an amazing place.
Yes.
I'm so sorry when it was pulled down.
Yes, I was very fond of it, actually, yes.
Yes.
Though you could never find your way around.
No, everybody said that, it was just like a maze, but no, I just loved it as a building, and the fact it was an old film studios that went back to 1920s or whenever.
Absolutely. It even had a tank, didn't it, under the floor?
I believe so, yes, under Studio G, was it?
Well, I think they did one of the Titanic films, the original sort of black and white Titanic.
Oh, A Night to Remember, possibly?
Yeah, something like that.
Yes,
I think it was done there. Now, what was your general impression of the BBC as a sort of cultural place, cultural institution?
Very good, actually. I think people generally treated you well. And I mean, the supervisors, the managers, that sort of thing. I mean, you got occasional ones that I wouldn't, really want to work under with hindsight. But sure. But generally they were pretty good, and it was fairly easy going. I did find rather an unpleasant change, I have to say. As I said, I went initially into telecine, which was great, but of course after doing that, you then had to do what was called the circus, which is where you also went to the other 2 areas of television recording department. And in my case, that involved going to film maintenance at Ealing Studios. I think I was only supposed to be there for 2 weeks, I think. But it was 1972, and the Olympics were on. Yeah, the Olympics in Munich. And I was supposed to go on to videotape, but of course, understandably, they didn't want to take new people, while they were all up to their necks in the Olympics. So I ended up spending, I think, either 4 weeks or 6 weeks at Ealing Studios on film maintenance, and it was the only time in my entire career that I actually worked days, i.e. Monday to Friday office hours. It's awful. I mean, I was there for 6 weeks, I think, and it felt like 6 months. When I joined and I went on station, I did the initial TA circus, technical assistant circus, where you went round all the departments of Television Centre just to look at them. Went to studios and news and all sorts of places. And then I was told, now you're going to go to do your real work, as it were. And they gave me a calendar. and it said what days I was working, and I looked at it and I thought, what's this? And I thought, hang on, but what about this day? And they said, oh no, you're off duty that day. Really? And that day? And that day? And of course, it turned out that I was actually on what was called the AP shift in those days, the Alexander Palace shift, which was actually a 7-day fortnight. Yeah, it was Monday, Wednesday, Saturday, Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and then it repeated itself. And I couldn't believe this. I thought, I've really only got to go into work 7 days a fortnight. I imagined I'd be Monday to Friday, I thought, this is amazing. I cannot believe this. This is so good. Having days off during the week was just wonderful. And, of course, when I went to Ealing to film maintenance, I had to work days, and it was awful. I thought, this is terrible. I'm going to work every day. So anyway, I was quite glad when that ended. I mean, it was. I enjoyed it there. It was good. Although it was a workshop job, it was good.
I was going to ask you about that. I mean, film maintenance in those days when everything was, run by clockwork rather than electricity, if you know what I mean. The equipment was what you were maintaining was completely different.
Oh yes. I mean, you were maintaining tape recorders and things like that, and stornophones, which were sort of walkie-talkies that were used by the film crew. Yes, and they were awful things to repair, absolutely dreadful things to repair. And I remember going out into Walpole Park, which is behind the studios, of course, testing these things, talking to people. And we also went into the dubbing theatres and places like the transfer suites where you had rows of set mag bays, separate magnetic tracks, which all the soundtracks that made up the sound of the film were all laced up onto separate machines, and they all ran locked together with this frightening system called telecine. And the dubbing mixer would then mix it down, and so we maintained all of that, and the amplifiers, the loudspeakers, everything.
Yeah. I quite liked Ealing. It was a very sort of quirky place, wasn't it?
Again, like Lime Grove, so much history. Yeah. Just such a wonderful place, and I'm so glad that it's still there and it's still making films to this day. I believe it's got a very good case for being the oldest continuously working film studios in the world, if you count the time that it was the BBC Film Studios, which I think I do.
Yes,
iconic place, in film history.
So when you were, as it were, after you'd finished going round and round and seeing everything and finding your feet, you then settled down within the telecine area?
Yes, I mean, I was very lucky. I mean, I was going to say I got on very, very well in telecine. Everybody was very kind, very friendly, very easygoing. It was a very, very good experience. I enjoyed that, and I enjoyed Ealing as well. When I went to videotape, it was a slightly different story, I'm sorry to say.
Yes.
They seemed to take the job very much more seriously there, and they didn't tolerate any sort of frivolity or anything like that.
Well, they were making editorial decisions in a sense. I mean,
well, maybe, yeah, but just in the routine
editing
stuff, like playing stuff to air from the transmission suites and playing inserts in studios and recording from studios, that sort of thing. I mean, I didn't get involved in the editing side. I mean, in those days, the editors, there were no edit suites in those days. I mean, it was literally done by dubbing from one machine to another.
And this was still 2-inch?
Oh, 2-inch, absolutely, yes, yeah. And some programmes were even still cut edited. They would actually get the razor blade out and slice the tape.
The L-shaped edits.
That's right.
Because the sound and the picture were in different places.
That's right, yes. A lot of the people were friendly. I mean, don't get me wrong. But it was a very different atmosphere to telecine. And I didn't like it as much.
Of course, with videotape, we were talking about the L-shaped edits and so on and so forth. I mean, if you were in those booths, you would be there with production, whereas in telecine you were not. Generally not.
No, that is true. Because
you'd be answering a buzzer, wouldn't you? Stand by telecine.
That's right. Yes. Yeah, I mean, in videotapes, certainly in editing, obviously, you would always have someone from production there with you.
Well, if that explains the difference in the culture.
It may have been. It may have been partially that. I mean, to quote an example, I had never bothered to join the union. The union, which was the Association of Broadcasting Staff in those days, which I've always been led to believe was a union that was virtually set up by the BBC to keep the other unions out of the BBC. They didn't want the ACTT or anybody like that in the BBC, causing problems and disruption. So I've never really thought very much about joining a union. I never bothered with it. I remember when I went to videotape one day, there was some sort of industrial dispute going on, and the union rep at the time was going around the area handing out leaflets about something. I can't remember exactly what it was, and he offered me a leaflet, and I said, "Oh no, sorry, I'm not a union member." And he said, "Oh, aren't you?" And well, to cut a long story short, it was made very clear to me very quickly that, of course, I was quite free to join the union or not join the union as I wished, because there was no closed shop in the BBC, of course. Yes. But if I wanted my workmates to speak to me, it might be a good idea if I joined.
Gosh.
And that was a threat as far as I was concerned. Yes. And I remember when I left, I remember chatting to the guy who was one of the union high-ups, at the sort of leaving do we had in the bar at Television Centre, and I said to him, I have never regretted joining the union, but I do regret joining under that sort of pressure. That was not good. So it was just little things like that annoyed me, and I did, as I mentioned, cut edited tapes. I had to do a technical review because obviously all tapes, before they were transmitted, had to go through a review process to make sure they were okay. And I had to review a tape that had cut edits in it, and I wrote in the review box on the card that went with the tape, I said, "Beware cut edits," and I drew a skull and crossbones, just as a joke. Yes. I was hauled into the supervisor's office and told that if I did not learn to take my job more seriously, I would be in serious trouble.
Really? Gosh.
Something like that would never have happened in telecine.
Yes.
They would have seen the joke. I thought, no, I don't like this at all. This is not pleasant. So I was only there for 6 months, I think, and then of course I went on my second course at Evesham, the B course, which was a purely television course. And after that, thankfully, I was posted back to telecine. The other problem I had going to videotape, which was obviously something out of my control, was that usually when you moved from one area to the other in the department, you stayed on the same shift. And I didn't. For some reason, I was on shift 2 in telecine, and I spent almost all of my shift working career on shift 2. But for some reason, when I went to videotape, they put me on shift 1.
What was the difference?
The difference was that, as far as I was concerned, when I wasn't happy in videotape, when things were getting me down, I couldn't go up to telecine and chat to anybody I knew about it, because everybody up there was a complete stranger. The shifts were... It was so odd. If you went in on an off-shift day, it was like being in some sort of parallel universe where all the inanimate objects were the same, but all the people were different. Yes. It was really bizarre because the shifts never met each other. That didn't happen.
And it was that rigid.
Oh yes, yeah. It was very, very rare that you worked across shift. So of course, when I was in videotape on shift 1, I used to go up to the telecine area to pick up my post and that sort of thing, because it still went there, and it was just weird. You walked in and I know this place so well, but these people are complete strangers. These people are complete strangers. Yes. So that was a disadvantage. But I was very happy when I did my B course at Evesham that I was posted back to telecine on shift 2, which is where I'd been happiest, and I stayed there for the next 20 years or whatever it was. Right.
How did the equipment change in those days, or were you were still with the same machines?
Nothing changed for at least, I would say, the first 10 years of my job. Things didn't really start to change until the sort of very late 70s. As we said, the videotape, of course, was all 2-inch when I worked there the first time. 1-inch machines came in the sort of late 70s, 79, 80, that sort of thing. And about the same time, we also started getting a new type of telecine machine, the Mark III, made by the same people that made the original machines. And this was also an enormous breakthrough, mainly because for the first time you could actually wind the film backwards and forwards in the machine, which you couldn't do in the old machines. Oh, really? It was normal speed forwards and backwards, and that was it. And also you could put different film gauges in the same machine. You could put 16mm film and 35mm film in the same machine, whereas up till then, of course, you either had a 16mm machine or a 35mm machine. So, overnight, potentially that halved the number of machines you needed, of course.
But they were all colour by the
mid-70s. Yeah. I vaguely remember there were a couple of black and white telecines still in existence when I joined, hangovers from the old days. I remember Yes, there was one that we used for nitrate film, which is the highly inflammable and dangerous film they used in the early days of the cinema. And there was a black and white machine at Lime Grove, because obviously anything nitrate was almost certain to be black and white, which was built like a, well, I don't know, like a battleship. I mean, it had enormous, great cast iron doors and things, you know, where you sealed everything in just in case anything happened. You know, it was. There were odd hangovers like that still around from.
I suppose nitrate film. I mean, if the film froze in the gate, it might catch on fire.
Well, true. Yeah, well, certainly in the cinema, of course, this was a big problem because they used enormous, you know, arc lamp projectors in those days, you know, carbon arc projectors.
Course, yes.
And one of the things they had, and the telecine machines had them as well, was they had a fire trap, you know, at the top and bottom, which was the idea was to stop any fire getting into the spool of film up on the top. The idea is it went through a couple of plates that were sort of sandwiched together, although obviously enough to allow the film through. And the idea was that the fire wouldn't get through there; it would snuff it out. The idea is if the film stopped, even for an instant, in a carbon arc projector, of course, what was in the mechanism would just go up in smoke instantly. But the idea was that it would stay just in that middle bit. Sure. Hopefully not burn the whole projection room down.
Did you have any nasty moments with machines breaking down on air?
A few, yes. I mean, I was quite lucky, really. I don't remember a great disaster. I do remember the first. It wasn't actually a breakdown. Yeah, it didn't actually drop off the air. But I do remember the first problem I had on a transmission. There was a series called The Double Deckers, which was a children's series made, I think, by the Children's Film Foundation, and it was supposed to be a sort of British answer to the Monkees, if you remember them, the American series, and we used to transmit those on Saturday mornings. One day I was transmitting one of those, and right at the beginning there was actually a join, you know, a tape join between the leader and the actual film, which was not at all unusual. And I think it had stretched or something, as they sometimes did. And we always rehearsed films before they were transmitted, you know, to make sure they were all right and see what the colour was like and all that sort of thing. And it had obviously survived the rehearsal without any problem. Nobody noticed that there was anything wrong. But what happened in this occasion was it went on the air, and immediately the film jumped out of the claw on the gate. Oh, right. So it was leaping up and down all over the place. Yes. And at that time, I did not know what the trick was to actually fix that. There was actually a roller underneath.
Without stopping the machine and starting it again.
Indeed, yeah. There was a roller underneath the gate, which was part of the sound system, you know, because where the optical sound head was, because it read, you know, a soundtrack actually off the film. And what you did was you flicked this roller to the right, and it would pull it back onto the claw again. I see. Now, I didn't know this, and I was sticking my finger in trying to get it back on there, and it was going all over the place. One of my colleagues came and rescued me and said, no, you just need to do that. And there it was. Right. And of course the sound was going all over the place as well, because it was an optical soundtrack. Yes. But that, I've always remembered that. That was the first time I actually had an on-air problem. Yeah. There were odd others, but generally the system was pretty reliable. And when you think some of the things we used to do in telecine live on the air, I mean, panning and scanning cinemascope films with, you know, punch tape and this sort of thing, you know.
Sorry, explain that.
Well, cinemascope films, of course, are widescreen films. Yes. Yeah, and on 4x3 television, which is what we're talking about now.
Which is what you still had. Yes.
Yeah. If you wanted to see the whole film frame, you had a really, really deep letterbox, you know, with a huge amount of black at the top and bottom, and obviously a strip of film in the middle. Now, this was considered unacceptable for transmission. There's no way you would ever transmit a film like that. So they had this wonderful system where on the telecine machine, they would sort of zoom into the frame, which meant, of course, you were losing all the sides.
Yes.
So what they developed was a system that sort of panned and scanned, as they called it, the film, so that you basically followed the action. You know, so if somebody walked across shot, for instance, you could actually pan part of the film frame you were looking at to follow the action. And this was done by what nowadays seems like an incredibly crude system, where they put metal dots on the edge of the film to cue where these changes were to happen. And the actual changes, the data for, you know, where it was supposed to pan to or cut to, was on a punch paper tape that ran in a machine.
Oh, really?
And we used to do that. I mean, we did start actually putting them on tape because the system wasn't terribly reliable to start with, but eventually it was deemed to be reliable, and we were doing this live on transmission. And of course you can imagine what would happen if this thing got out of sync or anything. Yeah. You know, the picture would be jumping all over the place and you'd be looking at the wrong part of the shot, you know.
Well, so if you come to a cut in the story, presumably the framing would be all wrong again.
Well, it could be, yes, yeah. I mean, this framing pre-program was actually done by a film editor because effectively you were potentially recutting the film. I mean, a classic example I always quote is you've got a long scene with two people sitting in a car side by side talking to each other, and you could only see one of them at a time because of the cinema scope. So you've got to cut backwards and forwards, following the dialogue. So it was considered that needed to be done by a trained editor. Because
how quickly could this thing respond?
Oh, very quickly, yes. Oh, yeah. I mean, you didn't see it happen.
Right.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So within frame blanking.
Absolutely. Frame blanking, indeed. Yes. It would cut from side to side and obviously pan across the frame if necessary.
Yes. Oh, that's extremely interesting, yeah.
I mean, you tell the youngsters of today about things like that, and they don't believe you, classic line. And you think, what? You did what? So there were all sorts of things like that we used to do in telecine. I mean, subtitles running on separate rolls of film, locked together with the picture, and all sorts of things like that.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But of course, that all died pretty quickly. Once we got into the 1980s, they moved away from that. And in fact, we stopped transmitting from film in 1987. We stopped actually quite a long time after most other television companies had stopped.
Dubbed onto tape.
Everything was put onto tape. Yeah, because and. I hated it because I loved doing film transmissions.
Yes.
I found it really demanding and really, it felt like a real achievement, especially if you were doing a complicated film transmission to get it done, with no problems and all the rest of it. And just dubbing stuff to tape was never going to be the same, I'm afraid. But obviously it did have its advantages because once you had a good version on tape, you could then use that forever afterwards. You didn't have to go back to the film again. So, you can't really argue against it.
Yeah.
But it took a lot away from the job for me when we stopped doing film transmissions.
Sure. Now, grading, I mean, we would sometimes go into a telecine area with a film that needed grading.
Yes.
And we would sit with the grader.
Yes.
And run it backwards and forwards.
That's right.
And they would say, is that all right? Or something, or you basically leave it to them. Most of it, I imagine.
Yes.
But colour balance was, and I presume it was largely colour balance, was it?
Largely colour balance, also brightness and contrast, of course. I mean, I know you worked mainly in documentaries, didn't you?
Yeah. Well, yes.
Where obviously you were sometimes working in very difficult conditions with available light and all the rest of it. So no matter how much the laboratories in those days managed to grade the print,
yes,
and of course you would have been working off prints presumably at that time.
Yes.
There were always variations with drama, which is what I, eventually came to largely specialise in. Of course, there was also the look that was required for the drama. The director of photography and the director and the film editor would all sit and they'd tell you what it was all about and all the rest of it and what sort of look they wanted from it.
The director of photography would be very, very precise about his look.
Yes.
And you could ruin his look, presumably.
Absolutely, yes. Oh, yeah. I mean, there's all sorts of horror stories about... sometimes the director of photography was there for the grade, but not always, because very often, of course, they were right in the middle of their next job.
Yes.
Or the job after next, by the time it got to that process in the post-production process. So they couldn't be there. So they were really relying on the director and in a lot of cases, the film editor, because the film editor, although obviously he or she's main job was obviously cutting the film, they also liaised with the laboratories about the grading of the film.
Yes.
In the days when it was done from graded prints. So they would sit in a viewing theatre and they would watch the film and they'd make notes and all the rest of it, and they'd then go back to the labs and say, well, this needs to be darker, this needs to be lighter, that looks a bit blue, and all the rest of it. And they would do another print with those adjustments made, and you went through a process which was called answer prints. So you do the first answer print, which had hopefully all the obvious errors taken out of it by the labs, because the grader in the labs, what they call a colour timer in the film industry, they would actually sit and they would look at the film and they would make an assessment, what needed to be done, to balance it out. But that wasn't necessarily, what was correct, of course, as far as the makers of the film were concerned.
Yes.
So you would then watch the first answer print and you'd go through and you'd say, this is too dark, this is too light, whatever.
Yeah.
They'd make the adjustments and you'd go for a second answer print and the third answer print, and eventually you'd end up with the transmission print.
Yeah.
And the last answer print before the transmission print we always ran as a backup. when we were doing telecine transmissions, because there was one big vulnerability with telecine transmissions, certainly with BBC-made stuff and a lot of other stuff as well, that the picture and the soundtrack were actually separate. So you'd put the film, into the telecine machine, and you'd put the soundtrack into the set mag bay, which was next to it, and you'd lock them together, and you'd run, and the sound would be in sync with the picture. If anything went wrong, like the film broke or something, yes, you could take the film out and you could stick it back together and put it back in the machine. How do you resync the sound? Impossible. Not without going right back to the beginning again.
Top, yeah.
So to avoid that disaster, and it would have been a disaster, we always ran a backing copy, on the basis that it was very unlikely that both copies would come to grief. So that was what the last answer print was used for.
Did you sometimes have to run reversal film?
Oh yes, that was very common for things like news and current affairs.
Yes.
Because obviously they hadn't got time to go through all this process of grading and all the rest of it. Indeed, of course, it cut the turnaround time incredibly if they could literally transmit from the film that ran in the camera, which of course you couldn't do with normal film because you had a negative in the camera and you then had to make a print from the negative and all the rest of it, all of which took time. So yes, reversal film, I mean they would literally bring the film back from the location wherever they'd been shooting. The editor would cut, obviously the film would be processed, Ektachrome or whatever it was, which produced a print straight away. The film editor would then physically cut that print, join it together with sellotape, and that's what would go in the telecine to be transmitted. Now, of course, there was no grading process there, so you were very much at the mercy of the cameraman having got the exposure right and used the right filters and all the rest of it. And of course, if you're in a war zone, you're running down the street with the camera with bombs going off around you, you're not going to sit there and think, I need this filter now, and so yes, it was often very variable. So yes, we used to struggle with that sometimes. I mean, things like Nationwide and that sort of thing. We ran films in the telecines at Lime Grove, and completely ungraded. And you sat there clutching the joysticks, ready to, take correct shots that were bright blue or shots that were incredibly dark or whatever. So you just did your best. Yeah.
And they didn't have a way for you to preview a grading change. I mean, it's almost as if you wanted to be able to see the film 5 seconds before it was transmitted.
Well, yes, that would have been nice, but not in those days. No,
not easy to do.
No. I mean, no, it was literally done live on the fly. There was no other way. No. I mean, we did get programming systems in eventually, again based on punch tape, a thing called PTC, Program Tariff Control, which actually was a system that had electronic memory in it, which was the problem of the age in those days. That actually remembered the settings that you'd had for a shot, and I seem to remember. I think you were allowed to do 16 shots or 12 shots or something into the memory, and if you then kept going, it would then start putting the data onto a punch paper tape. Once it was on a punch paper tape, of course, you couldn't then change it because it had been physically punched into the tape.
Yeah, sure.
So you had to hope that something wasn't cutting too rapidly, so that if you needed to do it again, you could stop the machine, wind back, and you would wind back through the memory, and you would then add subsequent corrections to the memory. And then once you were hopefully happy with it, you would then run on and it would put it on the punch tape. Horrible clunky system. I only used it very, very occasionally, thank goodness. They had much better systems later.
Sure. But I mean, that towards the end of your career, things began to change, didn't they?
They certainly did.
Because a lot of the BBC work went outside.
It did. I will never forget, because by the time that happened, I was working in videotape again quite a lot of the time, because telecine and videotape were sort of integrated in one of the first of many, many reorganisations that came subsequently. As I said, for the first 10 years of my career, really nothing changed. Then in the early 80s, of course, everything started changing. They decided, quite rightly, that they wanted telecine and videotape to be run by operators and not engineers. So they split operations and engineering apart. A sensible decision, because they quite rightly said that a lot of people who would have been very, very good operators in videotape and telecine were barred from the job because they didn't have the technical theory that you needed to get into the job in the early days. And of course, the equipment by then was an enormous amount more reliable. You really didn't need engineers operating it anymore because it didn't break down every 5 minutes, hopefully. So yes, once that was done, because of that, I went back to videotape again, which was all 1 inch by then. Or there were still 2-inch machines around, but the whole operation had really moved over to 1 inch.
Yes.
You know, I started getting involved in videotape editing, which I really enjoyed. You know, it was good. It was successful, I think, the integration. A lot of people were very, very apprehensive about it, especially some of the telecine old-timers, you know. And indeed, I'm afraid some of the old-timers in videotape didn't like the idea either, because they'd always rather look down on telecine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember somebody saying that as far as the attitude was concerned, you were only in telecine because you weren't good enough to be in videotape, which was an appalling thing to say, and wasn't true.
Sure. So you became a VT editor, effectively?
I never actually had a job as a VT editor. You know, I did do videotape editing on an acting basis, occasionally. You know, I had a few things which I remember where one was actually an edition of Question Time that was coming from some OB somewhere, as it still does, of course. And there was nobody from the production with me at all, and I recorded this program on a pair of 1-inch machines.
Yeah.
And I was acting editor because obviously I accepted that I'd be doing any editing that was needed. And we got to the end of the recording, and the guy at the other end rang up and said, "Is everything okay?" And I said, "Yeah, it's fine." "Right, no, so I just want you to take out this bit here where I think they took the microphone to the wrong person, and it all looked a little bit awkward and a bit clunky. So if you can take that out, that's fine. Everything else is okay." And I thought, "Oh, yeah, okay." And then I suddenly realised there was already less than the duration of the programme to the transmission time. And I thought, "Oh my God, how am I going to do this?" Because normally, of course, you dub the whole programme.
Yes.
There was no time to dub the whole programme. So I ended up having to sort of back edit the front of the programme onto the back of the programme. But I was unprepared for this. I was really, really out of my comfort zone. But fortunately, I was okay. I thought, well, I know I've got to do this and this and this, and I had the right equipment to do it, the timecode synchronizers and all the rest of it. So I back edited the front of the program onto the end, and got it back to the top on cue, reasonably before the red light started flashing. Right. But that was a wake up call. Gosh, I thought, yes. I'm good. You see people doing things like that in sport all the time. Yes. I hated sport editing. I found that so intimidating. I thought, no.
Yeah. Very pressured.
But it was things like that kept me in love with the job. Because that was such an achievement as far as I'm concerned. Yes. I mean, an experienced VT editor wouldn't have phased him or her for the slightest, of course. But for me, that was an achievement that I'd actually done that and I got that program on it. So it opened up a whole new ballgame, really, going to videotape and getting involved in editing, working in the edit suites, which were standard by then, of course. Working with editors and obviously producers and directors and people as well. Doing things like digital video effects, which were science fiction when I joined, of course. All these wonderful machines that could whirl the picture around and make it into boxes and things.
And you actually had those with you in the edit suite?
Yes, we did. Yeah. Yes. I mean, the very first one, the famous Quantel, there was only one of them, and it was in one of the studios. It was in one of the studio apparatus areas. So, but you could use it in videotape. You could use it in an edit. That was a horrible thing. I never got to grips with it. I mean, it was a classic example of someone that had been programmed completely by engineers who hadn't got the faintest idea how operators would actually expect to use it. It was horrendous. But anyway, all those sort of advances in technology came along, and everything changed. As I say, we stopped doing film transmissions. It's and then we moved areas. Of course, we were in the central wedge, as it was called, a television centre, which is now vanished completely, of course. And telecine was on the first and second floor, and of course videotape was down in the basement under the fountain.
Of course it was, yes.
Area 1 was, and there was an area 2 sort of off the corridor down in the basement. And in the very early 90s, we moved to new areas in stage 5, which had been recently built, and everything started to go digital. We started getting digital tape machines and all this sort of thing. But I mean, the changes are just horrendous. I mean, inevitably over nearly 40 years, but broadcasting has probably changed more than some industries in terms of the technology involved.
When the technology changed, did you go back and have more training courses?
A few, yes. Not that many, actually. I remember there was a digital techniques course, which took me back to Evesham, which was mainly concerned with digital monitoring and this sort of thing, like how you monitor digital signals relative to analog signals. It was interesting, it wasn't a serious course. There's no exam or anything like that, but it was, it was a fascinating thing to do. And I also did a film editing course at Evesham. In fact, I think that was the first one I did, where we went to learn, the techniques of film editing, which by then had moved from cutting bits of film apart and sticking them together with sellotape to using computers, using things like Lightworks and Avid, which is now the standard. And that was absolutely fascinating as well, because you could see where this was going.
Yes, quite. Non-linear editing.
Non-linear editing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Just complete game changer.
Yeah, it was a game changer, wasn't it? Yeah.
Some of the film editors did not like the idea of it at all. They liked to get their hands on the actual material, but most of them were pretty soon converted.
Coming to the end of the career, what was it like towards the end? What was it? Changes.
What happened? You touched earlier on about producer choice and moving stuff away from being produced in house. I do remember being absolutely amazed that when we came to do transmissions from the transmission suites in videotape, almost overnight, and it seemed to be almost overnight, suddenly all the tapes on the trolleys in the transmission suite had come from outside companies. They were not BBC tapes anymore. Yeah, it can't have been actually overnight, of course, but it happened very, very quickly. Suddenly so much stuff was coming in from outside facilities houses, as they were called, rather than being made in-house by us. And that was a bit of a shock, really. I thought, and I looked at these tapes. Oh, this is a tape from such and such a company and such a company. And, it was that was a bit of a wake-up call, really. Because, of course, what happened was that we started losing a lot of our work, although, of course, in theory, we could still compete for all the work, but now we had, of course, to compete with outside companies. And I won't say there was any sort of anything underhand going on, but there was an almost obscene rush by a lot of production companies
to move
out and away from working with BBC people.
Yes.
Not because they didn't like working with BBC people.
The resources cost so much.
They cost so much.
The overheads were so great.
Yeah. They had ludicrous things. You probably know the classic case of it cost far more money to hire a CD from the BBC record library to use something from it in a programme than it cost to go down and buy Our Price Records in Shepherd's Bush.
Yes,
ludicrous. Yeah, it's one of the first things Greg Dyke stomped on, I'm glad to say, when he came in.
Yes, he did.
Nonsense,
Actually, Yes, that's right.
But it was things like that. It just looked so bad. I thought, what is this? It's not.
So what caused you to leave? Did you get to the ripe old age of 60 or?
No, I made up my mind when I was 50 that I didn't want to do it for another 10 years. Yeah. I always imagined I would retire at 60 with 42 years of service it would have been, and the applause of my admiring comrades in my ears, as I left, But by the time I got to 50, and I thought, do I really want to do this for another 10 years? The job I never ever stopped learning on the job. I always said, if I ever stop learning on this job, I won't want to do it anymore. And I never did stop learning. And I never got to the point where I didn't look forward to going into work. Most days. I knew so many people outside the BBC who absolutely hated their job. Hated going into work, would take every day off sick they could get away with, And I was always so grateful I was never in that position. I always really enjoyed my job. I look forward to going to work. But it wasn't what it was. I remember the days, obviously, of doing transmissions, as I said, which I loved. And also, for a fair period, before producer choice came in, I was working on a lot of very, very prestigious programmes. Film dramas, film documentaries, all sorts of things. Really, great stuff, significant stuff. And, of course, all that went. I mean, it was all sort of siphoned off to people outside. And I'm afraid our management was a lot of the problem. I mean, this obviously happened in so many industries. I'm sure it's happened in the NHS and loads of other places as well. But the moment you have this pseudo-commercialisation of an organisation like the BBC, you start bringing people in who are professional managers. And for years and years and years, all our managers and supervisors were people who literally worked their way up from the shop floor. They were people who had actually done the job. I mean, yes, obviously the job had changed out of all recognition in many cases, but they had, done the job and they knew what we did. We then started getting managers in. I mean, one classic one was a girl who had been a manager at a biscuit company. She came in to manage us. She knew absolutely nothing about what we actually did at all, but she was considered to be a good manager. And if you're a good manager, apparently you can manage anything, even if you know absolutely nothing about it, And this was a really bad principle, and they started bringing in all sorts of pseudo-commercialisation policies and this sort of thing, which actually made my department very difficult to deal with.
Micromanagement and bean counting. And
exactly,
yes.
Yeah. It made us difficult to deal with for programme makers, which was unforgivable. So they would go to other places where they were treated better, and
yes.
they didn't have endless obstacles put in front of them to everything they wanted to do, and all that sort of thing. And gradually, of course, that eroded away our work base. We started losing all this prestigious drama and all the rest of it that we used to do, and I was heavily involved with that, and I'm consider myself very fortunate to have been involved in such major things, like the 1995 Pride and Prejudice, for instance, which I graded and all that sort of thing. And you come in, you'd work with directors and you'd chat to them, ask them what they'd done before, and they turn out to be quite major film directors and this sort of thing. People who directed feature films,
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you start to take a bit for granted after a while, and it was a bit blasé, but it's an example of the talent that the BBC attracted to make programmes for them. When that had gone, I think the spark had actually gone for me. We ended up doing things like remastering, which is basically tarting up old programmes for years and years, of course, when home video came along, for years and years they got away with VHS tapes. They would just take the transmission tape and they transfer it to a VHS master, and make copies from that. And because VHS was not particularly good quality, of course, they got away with that. When DVDs came along and the home video really was good quality, of course, you started seeing all the defects in these old programmes, stuff made in the 70s and that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, film that was all flickery and covered in dirt and scratches and,
and tended to go sort of greenish too.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
16mm stuff. Just a small point going back a bit. I mean, when you had 35mm,
yes,
people say it's the same quality as HD now. Is that true?
The resolution capability of 35mm film is amazing. It surpasses HD video.
Does it? Yes.
It's sort of equivalent. I mean, 4K video, which is what we have now, of course, is getting to the point where it is actually more resolution capable than 35mm film. But, it's still very much on a par.
Because that's why Civilization looks so good.
Absolutely.
Because it was done on 35mm.
That's right. Yeah. One of the few series of that scale that was done in colour on 35mm.
Indeed.
And amazing it looks too.
Absolutely, yes.
But of course 35mm was horrendously expensive, which is why they went over to 16.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So, have you got anything you want to say as a sort of wind-up?
Well, only to say, just to say how I left the BBC. I mean, so I decided I wasn't going to stick it till 60, so I started paying ABCs into my pension at the maximum rate I could to try and top it up. Nice. Yeah, I couldn't buy added years, because apparently you can only buy added years if you wouldn't have been in the pension fund for 40 years at age 60. So basically, if you join the BBC before you're 20, you can't buy added years. So I started paying all this extra money in, and I intended to retire at 57, which was always given to be the sweet spot between having a few years early retirement and not losing out too much on the pension. Yeah, quite a lot of my colleagues years ago, they used to retire sort of at 57. But I'm afraid events overtook me, and in 2008 it would have been, they suddenly decided they wanted to get rid of a whole lot of people. And they said, we'd like you to go. So I said, okay, right. In that case, what's the offer? And they said, well, yes, you'll get full redundancy and all the rest of it. So I actually ended up only going about 18 months before I was due to go anyway.
Right. So it wasn't a terrible shock.
No, and I went off with an enormous pot of the BBC's money,
Yes.
which I would not have got had, of course, I just taken early retirement. If I'd retired voluntarily at 57, which is what I was intending to do, or I'd got my pension, but I wouldn't have got the redundancy money.
No.
So it was absolute no-brainer. I said, yes, please. I was sad to go, but it was it was the right time. It was the right time.
Yeah. What was the best time, do you think?
I think the best time for me, I think, was way back in the 1970s. When I was working in telecine and we were, playing stuff out to air from telecine all the time,
yes.
and obviously playing inserts into studios and that sort of thing. Yes, I remember working on things like Blue Peter and Top of the Pops and things like that. When they had to have a 35mm machine and a 60mm machine. And the 35mm machine was virtually never used by then. Very occasionally they'd have something that was on 35. And things like opening titles were sometimes on 35, which so you had to have a separate machine for that. And it was a really cushy life. It was such a cushy life. I remember we used to go in at 10 o'clock in the morning and I used to line up with the studio and ring them up and do all the things and everything. And then they would stand me down for almost the whole of the rest of the day.
Really? So
So I'd go down Shepherd's Bush Market and wander around the shops and this sort of thing. I mean, it was absolutely money for old rope.
just come back in time for line-up.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes.
I mean, we did this all the time at Lime Grove. I mean, we used to come in and we didn't really have anything to do until Nationwide came on at tea time. So we used to come in at lunchtime and we used to sit in the duty room, playing. Mahjong and bridge and that sort of thing. And, I mean,
you have to be careful, otherwise you would be saying Mr. Burt did the right thing.
Well, in a lot of ways, I have to say that he probably did.
Yes.
There was a huge amount of wastage going on.
Yes.
People that were underemployed, getting paid quite large salaries for not doing very much a lot of the time. Yes. That was what was behind integrating telecine and videotape, of course, because once you could do videotape work, of course, you were working all the time, because there was always work there. Whereas telecine, there was a lot of downtime, where there really wasn't anything to do. You couldn't justify that, not on long term. No. but no, they were happy days. I enjoyed them.
Yes, well done. Thank you very much for doing this. I think we've probably covered it, haven't we?
I think so. I don't think there's anything I wanted to say that I didn't say at some point.